of the biggest spectrum auctions that the government will conduct this week, and more importantly, for the very first time, 700 megahertz band will be put up for auction. Remains to be seen what could be the kind of industry appetite for that premium 4G band. To talk on all that and more, we have with us Telecom Secretary J.S Deepak in an exclusive conversation. Sir, many thanks for taking out the time for this interview. My first question to you is that this auction marks a significant shift in terms of a government stance, that it's not scarcity induced, but instead more quantum of spectrum is being put up for sale. How significant do you think is that for the government?
Yeah, the notable feature of this auction is that we are putting a whole lot of variety as well as volume of spectrum for sale. As you know, the discourse over the past decade and a half in the telecom industry has been that they have been starved for spectrum. They have not had global sized blocks, and this has affected both efficiencies as well as the quality of service. This spectrum, which we are going to auction, 2,350 megahertz of spectrum, provides a choice to operators to buy and pick what they don't have to complete the gaps in their bouquet, and once and for all it will eliminate the issue and the problem of spectrum scarcity in the Indian telecom space.
But you know, the counter view is that given the fact that it's not scarcity induced, it's obviously going to impact bidding strategy for companies. They are bound to be less aggressive because it's not a question of survival.
Companies will have their own strategies, they have the choice, and it's a market determined price that the auction will lead to. But the basic plus of this auction is that from 2G to 3G to 4G, in various bands from 700, 800, 900, 1800, 2300, 2500, we are putting a whole lot of spectrum which could meet the needs of individual players in different parts of the country. This is, the sector is now entering a data era.
Right.
And I believe that there are lots of telcos who have gaps in their spectrum holdings, and this is an opportunity for them to fill the gaps. In case they do not fill those gaps, they will suffer a competitive disadvantage going forward, especially in the data space, which is increasingly going to be important for provision of services, for entertainment, for e-commerce, for telemedicine, for e-education, and what have you.
Right. I'll come to the 700 megahertz band in a bit, but you know, if really one were to look at the EMDs or the earnest money deposits by companies, it really looks like this auction may actually be a very tepid affair, and I'll tell you why I'm saying that. Because if you know, you look at Idea's EMD, it's actually half of what it was in the previous auction. Likewise for Bharti, it is 2,000 this year, and it was actually upwards of 4,300 crore last year. Compare the fact that this time there is more spectrum being put up for table. So clearly, a very tepid auction may actually be what we are staring at.
We are putting a lot of spectrum out for auction. It doesn't mean that we expect that all of it would be sold. So there would be a choice which operators would exercise, and the EMDs which they have filed in this auction gives an indication of where they start the bidding.
Right.
The point to be taken is that all the 7 operators who are major operators in the country are participating in the auctions, depending upon their needs, and they will participate to different extents. Also, the EMD gives you the footprint of the auction,
Right.
which is the extent to which they can bid in the first round. It does not give an indication of the heights to which the auction may scale, which is in fact dependent on the competition.
Right.
So while there's a lot of spectrum, supply is large, and the government has not sought to profiteer from creating a spectrum scarcity, they have a choice of bidding, and there would be competition in many blocks for which there is great demand.
Right. You did mention that obviously you don't expect every last block to be sold. In your fair assessment, how much do you think the government will be able to sell in this round of auction?
It's an auction is about setting a transparent market determined mechanism for assigning of spectrum, so it would not be fair for me to try to anticipate what would be the extent of the bidding or the heights that it would scale or the money that it would lead to. But we do hope that while a lot of spectrum would remain unsold, lots of spectrum would also be sold, and that would go to meet the needs of operators for providing good quality services to the consumers, which is what the
entire objective
of government policy is and should be.
Right. What about government proceeds? You know, the overall value of the spectrum is pegged at a very humongous 5.5 lakh crore. The government has budgeted for about 55,000 crore, that will around about 55,000 crore to come in this year from spectrum sale proceeds. In your assessment, will the government be able to meet that target?
As I mentioned, that this spectrum is about ending spectrum scarcity in India once and for all. However, since it's an auction and auctions are about revenue, the government does expect to get revenue. How much of it will be, again, is something which I would not like to hazard a guess on. The market will determine what it would be. There is, of course, 4 lakh crores worth of 700 megahertz spectrum about which you have spoken, but there's also about 1,25,000 crores worth of other spectrum which is being auctioned, and to that has been added about 27,000 crores of spectrum in the 1800 megahertz and 800 megahertz bands, which we have got through the process of harmonization in the last few months. So there is beyond 700 megahertz spectrum, which is great quality spectrum for coverage, also almost 1.5 lakh crore of other spectrum from which the telcos can pick and choose.
The reason why I asked this is that, you know, if you look at last year's proceeds, you know, the upfront payment that came into the government was actually around 21,000 crore rupees, and what we're talking about this year that the government has budgeted for is about 56,000 crore rupees. We're more than doubling the kind of you know, the government target, which is why I'm asking, possible to meet that target, or do you think it will be really a very ambitious target for the government to achieve?
Again, I have no comments on what the government's expectations are and what the proceeds would be. We'll wait and watch for this auction to happen.
Fair enough. Let's now talk about the 700 megahertz band. A lot has been talked about. Every analyst worth his salt, to tallest leaders in the sector, they have all come and said that the pricing is all wrong. In your assessment, do you think 5 megahertz should be closer to 60,000 crore for 700 megahertz?
The reserve price for a block of 700 megahertz spectrum has been determined by TRAI on the basis of consultations, in which telcos, experts, academics, and various other stakeholders have had a say, and TRAI has recommended a price of about 57,500 crores per block. This is expensive spectrum, but then if you look at the characteristics of 700 megahertz spectrum, it is by far the best spectrum that we have today anywhere in the world in the communication space. For coverage purposes, both street level and indoors, it is top quality spectrum. Further, it's not only about spectrum pricing. An operator who deploys his network in this spectrum will arguably have to spend only a third of it in investment as compared to higher frequency bands. So there is a saving on rollout.
Right.
So all put together, while the spectrum price is high because it's good quality spectrum, it has characteristics and virtues which make it very useful spectrum, especially for the data communication in the 4G space.
Right. I'll tell you why I'm asking the reason for pricing to be expensive. Whether or not it is, we'll know in a couple of days. You were at the helm of affairs, at least you were the one leading the 2010 auctions, considered to be one of the most successful in Indian telecom till now. The reserve price was 3,500 crores. If my memory serves me right, the final winning price was upwards of 17,000 crore, around about that figure. That was a very successful auction. Do you think that model should have probably been here, maybe price it a little more conservatively? If it is so good, let market forces determine the price of 700?
And there could be various ways of fixing reserve price for spectrum, but that is in something which is in the realm of TRAI and its consultation process. And at this stage of point, I would not like to comment on that. The objective of a spectrum auction need not only be revenue maximization. In fact, a number of critics of Indian government policy in the telecom sector have said, including some ex-chairman of TRAI, that one of the problems that we've had is that we've concentrated on a revenue maximization model for spectrum auctions.
Right.
While that may be one opinion held by a very large body of people, both in industry as well as in academia,
Right.
this auction, and I will not comment whether I agree with it or disagree, but this auction takes care of the argument that here is an opportunity for telcos to get large chunks of the kind of spectrum they need in the circle they need at one go.
Right.
Through a transparent allocation process.
But this is not about revenue maximization?
If it was about revenue maximization, we would not have put all the spectrum that we have or we have got out of harmonization to auction. This is about meeting the needs of the sector so that it can fulfill its quality of service obligations. This auction is not about creating artificial scarcity to push up prices, but about providing an opportunity for telecom players
Right.
to get spectrum and plan their rollout over the next maybe a decade.
Right.
And I think there will be, after the spectrum auction, no argument ever that quality of service to the consumer in India, whether voice or data, is being hindered by shortage of spectrum. A peg for competition also, in addition to price.
Fair enough. One final question on the auction bit before we move on to a whole host of other issues. If one were to talk about the 700 megahertz ecosystem, it's still underdeveloped in India. There are not enough 4G handsets as well. Do you think a large part of that could actually change in the next couple of months with the 700 being auctioned right now? Or do you think India is still some time away from the entire 4G wave, so to say?
We don't have to be the last in every new technology. We were 20 years behind the world in 2G, we were 10 years behind the world in 3G, we were maybe 5 years behind the world in 4G. Now 700 megahertz ecosystem is being deployed in the US, in Europe. It has not yet been deployed in China. So putting 700 megahertz on auction now will also trigger the growth of this ecosystem. If you remember, 2300 megahertz was auctioned in 2010. There was no ecosystem. But the way the R&D efforts have happened, the way the ecosystem has grown, including the device ecosystem, today arguably 2300 is the most in demand spectrum for data services. So this auction, by putting 700 megahertz on the table, will, I'm sure, trigger the growth and accelerate the growth of the 700 megahertz ecosystem, including the availability of devices for that band.
There is a fair bit of acrimony, turbulence in the sector. I know a lot of it has to do with TRAI and it is not in your domain, but nevertheless, in your assessment, do you think this is something that telecom companies at the end have to resolve at their own level, or government or regulator will probably have to step in to ensure all stakeholders' interests are protected?
See, the Indian telecom industry is characterized by private enterprise, investment, innovation, competition, and some good government policy and regulation.
Right.
That is what has made it grow from 20 million phones in 1997 to 1 billion plus phones today.
Right.
And mobile has been the game-changing communication experience which the Indian consumer has got, and at the lowest prices in the world.
Right.
So this is transformational. The entry of a new player in a sector which is pretty competitive to start with, which has good competition, is bound to create some turbulence, and that's what's happening. But the way I look at it, if you look at what has made this sector successful, competition, private investment,
Right.
enterprise, all of this will get a flip by the entry of another player, and ultimately this would be good for the industry and for the consumer.
You said turbulence is bound to happen. In your assessment, do you think it's going to be short-lived, or do you think at the end of the day some intervention at some level may in fact be required?
So things will improve, incumbents will adjust, consumers will have more choice, so they will make adjustments, and things would settle down. In fact, they are settling down. If you see the pace at which it's a big new launch, even for the size of the Indian telecom sector.
Right.
So it will take some time, but I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that things will settle down, and it will be a win-win for various stakeholders.
Around the world, there are at best 5 operators. Where do you see Indian telecom, let's say about a year from now, when a lot of this turbulence would have settled in, as you mentioned, incumbents would have adjusted? In your assessment, how many operators do you think could survive 12 months from now?
It's difficult to predict, and bureaucrats are not the best soothsayers. So I would again refrain from saying that, except for the fact that if you look at the Indian telecom industry, you can see consolidation happening. There is
the Arcom Aircel thing happened, yes.
There are mergers and acquisitions being planned. There have been operators who've got out of the sector.
Right.
For instance, Videocon.
Videocon.
There has been spectrum sharing and trading being done amongst large operators. So all of it is happening, which shows that consolidation is kicking in the Indian telecom market.
So maybe ourselves would also be seeing, the Indian telecom market would also be seeing about 4 odd operators, at best 5 next year. By next year, maybe, whenever things settle in. I
do expect some consolidation, and there would be, as a consequence of that, increased efficiency, and which will be good for everybody.
This brings me back to the point that you just made, that yes, you are fortunate enough to see a lot that has happened in Indian telecom in terms of the big events that have really happened. You were also there, if my memory serves me right, in 2008, just when the licenses for the new players were given in, and when the whole boom really ushered in with lots of new players coming in. But there have been previous launches as well. Previous time also new players have come in. There have been mega launches as well. But have you seen this kind of fuss the last time over as well, or do you think this is something that is unique this time around, simply because of the size and the scale of the launch of the new player this time around?
Well, all of you call the telecom sector a very happening sector, so it does have a lot of, if I may, I'd like to call it's a vibrant sector, but a lot of people think there's lots of turbulence which happens, and every time there is an entry of a new large player, there is this kind of issues about interconnects, about termination charges, about level playing field, and so on and so forth. It's something which we have normally come to expect. In 2009-10, when Tata Docomo came in,
right,
it was much the same. The then incumbents made it difficult. Before that, when the licenses were given out to the private sector, BSNL was accused of blocking entry. So it is part of the game, and there is a system of handling it, and it will get handled.
Fair enough. Recently there were a lot of allegations that during the period that RelJio was actually in trial, of course now it's a commercial launch has happened, but nevertheless the reason why I asked this question is because the allegation that was raised by several sections of the industry was that, and the incumbents as well, that there was actually a serious revenue loss to the government on account of the extended trial period of RelJio. As somebody who is, of course, revenues of telecom companies is something that is bound to concern you. Did that actually worry you, or is that an allegation you thought was worth probing further?
I don't think that allegation has any basis or any merit. We in the telecom industry operate a revenue share mechanism.
Right.
If a telecom operator charges revenue, he has to pay a share of it to the government. If he or she doesn't charge revenue, then there is no dues to the government. So there is this concept of revenue loss in testing phase or in launch phase is just an academic
discussion.
Issue, a discussion. The government is keen that the price of the service to consumers should be affordable, and it should decrease. While we have had a success in the sense that we have 1 billion users, we should also not forget that there are still about 35% people who do not have access to mobile phones.
Right.
And there are 2/3 of our population, 800 million people, who do not have access to the internet, mobile internet.
Right.
And many of these are not able to access because of the cost of service. In spite of the fact that it will be lowest in the world, looking at our per capita GDP, it is because of the cost of monthly plan of broadband or of voice.
Is high.
So the government's interest is and will be, I'm sure, to ensure that prices are affordable and tariffs move southwards all the time.
But tariffs are likely to move southwards further. I mean, it's great news. Relgio offering free voice lifetime and free data right now, expected to be affordable going forward, is great news for customers. That will of course go a very long way in addressing the government's concern that more and more people should be empowered by the internet. But does that worry you? Because obviously others will also have to follow suit. It is a very competitive market. It's highly unlikely that the incumbents or other players will not respond to these tariffs. What they come out with, of course, we'll know, but they will respond. So do you think the financial health of the sector could be under stress going forward? Because at the end of the day, government's levies and taxes also stand to get impacted because of the revenues.
The telecom market is a scale market. There are huge economies of scale to be had if the number of consumers increase. Also, the changing technology from circuit switching to packet switching has reduced the cost of providing services substantially. To top it all, the efficiencies which come from large blocks of spectrum and harmonized contiguous spectrum.
Right.
So all of these will drive costs of operators down,
Right.
and are driving costs of operators down, so that they will be in a position to offer lower tariffs without having red splashed all over the balance sheet.
So you're not worried about government's revenue pie shrinking?
This is an argument which has been made repeatedly and has been found to be incorrect. When Tata Docomo shifted the price point from
To
1
1
rupee
paisa.
a minute to
Yeah.
1 paisa a second,
Right.
the discourse said that the telecom sector investments will vanish, will end,
Right.
operators would quit,
Right.
and so on and so forth. And look at it. After that, the EBITDA margins have grown,
Right.
their debt equity has gone down, they are making profitable, their reserves and surplus are going up, and they have made huge investments in 3G and 4G technology.
If we were to really talk about the policy decisions that have been taken in the last couple of months, some very important policy decisions that the government has in fact taken in the last couple of months, what according to you were the top 3 decisions that the government has taken in the last few months that has really helped the sector?
You talk of 3 major reforms, I would certainly place spectrum harmonization right at the top. It's the first time we have done it, and it has been a demand for the last 10-15 years, and this has led to a win-win-win for government, for industry, as well as for the consumer.
Right.
The second thing that we have done is that we have made it very easy for telcos to acquire new customers. One of the major costs which telcos face is the customer acquisition
eKYC,
cost.
yeah.
By linking the eKYC system to an automated electronic Aadhaar based eKYC, the costs will go down and the convenience of the customer will increase.
And what lies ahead? What is the kind of policy decisions that we can expect? Of course, a mega spectrum auction has happened, will take place. A lot of that is, of course, a huge policy decision for the government. But what lies ahead that the government can do for the industry?
See, while I think lots of things have been done in the last 2 years in improving the ease of doing business in telecom sector, there's still a number of things which we
in
are
the pipeline.
working on to come out with the right of way rules which makes acquisition of setting up infrastructure simpler, quicker, and the process transparent.
That's a pain
and
point for the
time-bound.
industry right now.
That, as you
Yeah.
know, is a major pain point for the industry, and that is something which is almost at its last stage and should happen in weeks rather than months. In addition, there are a number of licensing burdens which the telecom industry faces.
Right.
And we are working to simplify that to a great extent. And this would be, I think, in three parts. One is the SACFA clearance, the clearance for towers to make sure that they are not coming in the ways of aircraft parts, etc. The SACFA clearance is proposed to be automated and made electronic end-to-end online, rather than paper-based, which it is partly now. The second thing, even more important, is to look at whether we can do away with the import license for equipment being imported by telecom service providers. If a telecom service provider is importing equipment for his own use, why should he have to take a license? Can it not be replaced by something simpler like filing a registration? And the third thing, perhaps the most important, is whether we could abolish the wireless operating license for telecom service providers. These are the three areas which we are working on, and this is work in progress for the next quarter.
Right. With that, we wrap this up, sir. Thank you so much for taking out the time. Thanks so much, sir.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/etnow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at etnowlive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/etnow.